Shiatiki chumon molokiwash. Shiatiki chumon molokiwash. Shiatiki chumon molokiwash. Shiatiki chumon molokiwash. Kepakaki ahashil kuku. Pakaki ahashil kuku.
Hello, and welcome to Reclaiming Our Stories, Voices of Indigenous Peoples of California. I'm your story weaver, Victorio L. Shaw, a citizen of the Hoopa Valley Tribe and chief judge for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians and the Robinson Rancheria Tribal Courts. In this podcast, we sit down with Indigenous leaders, artists, historians, and community voices to share stories rooted in land, culture, and lived experience. These conversations invite us to listen more deeply to the histories, perspectives, and knowledge that continue to shape California today. Thank you for joining us. In today's episode titled Recognition, Rights, and the Space Between Law and Policy Now, we explore the intersections of Indigenous sovereignty, recognition, law, and policy in contemporary California. Joining us are Michelle Lee of the Pit River Tribe and Cahuilla Tribe, and Nicole Myers-Lim of the Pomo Tribe, whose work and lived experiences help us better understand the ongoing conversations surrounding Indigenous rights, representation, and self-determination. Let's begin. My guest is California native attorney Michelle Lee, who's descended from the Pit River and Cahuilla people. Hi, Michelle. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Victoria. It's great to be here.
It's good to see you. I'm wondering if you can give our listeners a little bit of background about you and the work that you do.
Sure. I could talk a very long time, but I'll keep it short. So I feel like I've been practicing federal Indian law since I was about 11 years old because I grew up in a family that was very politically active. And on my Cahuilla side, my grandfather was a member of the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. And they went to the United States Supreme Court in the late 1980s. And there was a decision out of the Supreme Court that established tribal rights to gaming across the country. And so that affected my family. It affected everyone around me because suddenly there was this shift from tribal governments being very impoverished to having opportunities to really exert their sovereignty and generate revenue for their people and regulate that activity. And so my mother was actively connected to that story. And she also was very interested in protecting tribal cultural resources. And those two combinations are things, that's the work that I do today. So my mother had an incredible impact on me. She passed away in 2018. And so I do think about that regularly, that those two areas. She wanted to be on the Native American Heritage Commission back then. And when I was young, she wasn't good at typing and I could type. And so I typed up her application to be on the Native American Heritage Commission. So those had profound impacts on me. And that's a lot of the work that I do today.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it sounds like becoming a lawyer was your destiny.
I don't feel like I had a choice. That's not in a bad way.
Right.
It's definitely something I think about quite often. The fact that I am on a path and it's not been straight. There's been lots of difficulties and challenges along the way. Being a first generation college student, a Native person that is a descendant of genocide, and my great grandmother from Northern California on my Pit River side, she survived a massacre up in around the Likely area in Northern California. And then later, her descendants, my grandmother ended up in an Indian boarding school in Riverside County, and that's where she met my grandfather. That's why we have the North and the South represented in my family. And so I have a background and a legacy. I come from the legacy of Indian boarding schools. So my life hasn't been the simplest with all of that historical trauma in my family line. But thankfully, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I'm still doing my thing.
We are, if nothing else, survivors as Native people. Turning to the topic of federal recognition, being a federally recognized tribe means you have a formal relationship with the government. However, there are many tribes that are legitimate groups of people who descended from common ancestors in California who do not have this federal recognition. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about federal recognition, what that means for a tribe, and how it affects the tribes who aren't federally recognized.
Yeah, federal recognition is such an interesting concept because when we look at Native tribes as a whole, especially in California, which is my focus, sovereignty comes from within, right? We say that sovereignty is inherent. And so the idea that there's this process, this external recognition of a tribe's sovereignty is a bit colonial, right? It's a outside looking in saying you're sovereign, but you're not. And that part is, for me, a conflict because I do know that there are legitimate Indian people in California and tribes that continue to practice their culture, that speak their language, and have a common, kinship and culture and structure of working together that do not have federal recognition. But they definitely consider themselves sovereign, and that sovereignty is inherent. And today, that concept is more discussed probably than ever because we have these laws that allow for tribal consultation. And tribal consultation, it's something that I've worked on since 2003. And that area of protecting cultural resources is the one area in California where that inherent sovereignty gets invoked and empowered more than any other area. And the federally recognized tribes, they have that recognition as a nation, which is in itself is incredible. The idea that there are all these nations within this nation, within the state, that have nationhood. They can enter into treaties, they can enter into certain kinds of contracts that nobody else can. They're immune from lawsuits, they're immune from suit unless they consent. So the idea of nations within a nation, it explains why so few people know about it because we are somewhat invisible. But if for those of us that are in it and entrenched in it, it's really amazing and it's an awesome power to have sovereignty.
So is it fair to say that the tribes that aren't federally recognized all would prefer to have that recognition?
Interestingly, no. And the reason some do not, that their primary goal may not be federal recognition is because they have that core belief that their sovereignty is inherent, and having the federal government recognize them, to them, in some ways diminishes their sovereignty.
Interesting. I know that in the work you do, you've worked with unrecognized tribes who are seeking that recognition. Can you elaborate on what a challenging process that is?
I haven't actively worked on a petition for some years. However, in the past I did. And what I do know is that there are tribes that are in the queue for federal recognition to have their application reviewed by the Department of Interior that have been in that queue for decades and at great cost. So that's one of the concerns for tribes that want to begin that process or are considering it. They see it as incredibly overwhelming in terms of the time and the cost. And if it's going to cost $1 million or more to do, where does that money come from? And I think that gets into the idea of investors. And that's when things get more complicated versus a tribe that wants to continue their way of life and utilize the rights that they do have and exert their internal sovereignty within the framework that doesn't involve that. So that's one of the reasons why not all tribes want to pursue it. But today the regulatory structure has changed. I think there's maybe 7 California tribes that are in the queue for the review by the Department of Interior. And that's not that many because there are, as I understand it, at least more than 80 tribes that are non-federally recognized in the state of California. And so out of the 80, if you only have 7 in the queue, there's some reasons why they're not in that queue.
Yeah, I know the process that the federal government has set up for applying for recognition is very cumbersome. It requires a ton of documentation. And as tribes, we didn't document our existence. We just existed. So it's sort of this unfair standard, really. It always strikes me when I look at a map of California and notice where the reservations are, that there are little to none along the coastal regions, in the Bay Area, Los Angeles. Do you think there are factors at play other than sort of these objective rules that prevent those tribes from becoming recognized?
Definitely. It's really historical. So as I understand it, it's really linked to the mission system in California. So when you look at the state map and you look at where there are gaps in tribes along the coast, you can really connect those to the fact that there were missions established there in early colonization. And so the mission system, which of course in California we have to study that in 4th grade, and people build their mission, and tribes and tribal advocates have really pushed back against that recently because it's such a hurtful time in our history as Native people to California, the mission system, because there was slavery, there was significant disease and rape and crimes against the people that were there. There were also laws implemented in that time that, for example, prevented tribal people from using fire in their environments to generate their food. And so today we have not to tangent too much, but today we have this renewal of cultural fire and bringing fire back into practice in California. But the missions were the initial source of the laws that punished Indians for doing traditional burning. But the mission system resulted in decimated populations. But ironically, there's lots of records. So there's records of the deaths, there's records of the births. And so tribal people that remained and survived that and their descendants, they remained in their areas where the missions had their ancestors enslaved. And then when the federal government was going around the state of California to take a census of Indian people and find out where they were and did they need help, often the tribal people, the tribal groups that were in the areas that had been missionized, the Indian agents that came out, they made a determination that they were fine. Basically, they didn't need help. They were in urban areas. They weren't maybe off in the mountains, with very little food and resources. So the fact that the descendants of people that were missionized were able to successfully adapt to colonization and survive, even though they kept their tribal identity and they lived in these urban areas. And so they were just sort of taken off the list of those that needed help from the federal government. And so some of those tribal groups that may want to seek recognition or could qualify, as a recognized tribe, they can show those records of when the Indian agent came and said, yes, this tribe is here and they live collectively together, but they don't need our help. And that's why they're not recognized today, which is interesting when you think about it today, that the federally recognized tribes were the tribes that the Indian agent said needed help. And the non-federally recognized tribes, the federal government had said they don't need our help. And so it's an interesting twist.
Yeah. When you were talking about the mission system and that early contact, it's a lot different than what happened in the northern part of the state, where there were no missions and contact occurred much later. Having both sides, in your family, can you talk a little bit about the experience of the northern tribes and how that was different?
Yeah, the northern tribes really went through a different form of decimation, right? Because we had armed militias that hunted us down. And it is harsh. It's harsh. And we carry, those of us that are descended from the people that survived, I mean, we do carry this still. It wasn't that many generations ago. It was my great, great, great grandma that was the first Indian that has a record of being alive, and that she had an Indian name, and then she changed it to, a non-Indian name, and she picked her name, which is also interesting because they're old-time Indians, they pick their names, so they have funny names. But my ancestor, she was Willis Colcold, and she chose the name Susie Jack because she was a follower of Captain Jack. And so you have a lot of people in that corner, the northeast corner of California, that took on the last name Jack because of Captain Jack. And Captain Jack was an important figure that fought the cavalry and actually killed the colonel and Canby. So he led an uprising and killed the military leader, and unfortunately, ultimately ended up being hung. But the battles in Northern California and the massacres that occurred throughout the northern part of the state are, why we have places called Bloody Island, and we have massacres called the Bloody Run. You know, Benjamin Madley, Professor Madley wrote a book all about it. And I'm told that from people that have read it, that I probably don't need to read it because we already know.
It's hard to read those accounts. So turning the lens a little bit towards gaming, because you are, as you mentioned, someone that's been involved in Indian gaming in California really since it became its modern form. How do you think gaming affects recognition?
It's controversial to say it, but we know that gaming affects recognition because it's a scarcity model, right? Unfortunately, there's only so much gaming, so many gamblers, so much of a market to share. And if we think about it, the tribes that have successful gaming locations, they want to hold on to those markets because they build an economy and they take care of their people, and they're doing what any of us would do. And also there's a fear and an idea that the tribes that might have attracted a developer or an outside financial backer that wants to build a casino in, say, Los Angeles, that they might not be the real group. They might not be the real tribe. They might be, pretendians. And that those are the ones that make their way through the gauntlet versus actual tribal Indians. So there's the lack of information. There's a lack of transparency. Who are these groups? Who are these groups that claim to be tribes? And until somebody gets in there with them, it's impossible to know which ones are legitimate and which ones are not. And so I think there's a barrier that is raised when tribes want to pursue federal recognition, because the idea is, well, they're just doing it because they want a casino, because they have an investor that's attached to them. We see that, in the Bay Area. And, I don't really want to get into the specifics about which tribes are doing what, but we do know that There are some tribes that have financial backers, and that has helped them get through the recognition petition process, developing one. But then there are tribes where there is obviously no application for gaming. There's tribes in the Yosemite area, for example, that there's one that has an application with the Department of Interior that clearly has no visible goal of having gaming, and they really want to ensure that they can protect their homelands from intrusion like that. So, who's the judge?
Yeah, and sometimes tribes like that who aren't looking to form a gaming establishment necessarily have to defend against those accusations by the surrounding communities, assuming that that's the primary reason they're looking to get recognized, and it feel like it hinders tribes from maybe getting recognized.
That's absolutely right. Even recognized tribes, when we want to acquire land and buy land in areas in the town or near a town or a city, there can be that perception that, oh, they're just going to put a casino on that land.
Right.
When in fact, maybe they want to have housing. So there's definitely a bias against Indians and tribal people acquiring land that, interestingly, that's sort of changing a little bit with all the land return that's going on. But of course, there's all these strict requirements and restrictive covenants that go along with those acquisitions so that tribes can't develop those properties, which is in itself controversial because that can't really be a homeland if we can't live there. We just have to take care of it and live someplace else, which is very strange.
When I teach federal Indian law, there's the classic eras of federal Indian policy, Indian self-determination, determination era, the allotment era. And I always put forth the idea that we're really in the gaming era. It hasn't made its way into the textbooks, but I feel like that's really the era that we're in. And I've noticed just in my lifetime a shift in public perception from a more sympathetic view towards tribes and Indian people to maybe an antithetical view, because the perception is that we all are rich from our casinos. Can you talk about that a little bit?
And thanks for giving me the title to my new book, The Gaming Era.
Yeah, there you go.
We're in the gaming era. Yeah, the gaming is a double-edged sword, right? It can be used to protect sovereignty, and it also can be used against us to limit our sovereignty by those that are opposed to it. And we've definitely, as tribes, gone through an early era after compacts were negotiated back in 1999. That era was extremely hostile towards Indian gaming. And the 80s, after the Cabazon decision in 1987, there was a real pushback against Indian tribes having the sole right to regulate gaming on their lands, which is what the Cabazon decision allowed for. And then Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and gave the states a role in Indian gaming by requiring compacts. And so big part of our work in Indian gaming is negotiating tribal state compacts, which are agreements that outline all the jurisdiction and the regulatory authority over the gaming operation. The compacts were objected to in many ways by parties. The unions, for example, wanted to regulate employment laws on Indian reservations. So there's been some intrusion there. And then the state wanted to have a say in what tribes were doing in terms of developing under ICWA. And that was really frustrating. And that actually began our era of doing cultural resource protection because the state wanted to control how tribes developed their reservations and what the environmental impacts were on those reservations. But at the same time, the state was not giving tribal people involvement when everything else was being developed. So, yeah, hostility towards gaming has been there. I do want to note that there's only really a handful of Indian tribes in California that have more than 2,000 slot machines, being a really large gaming facility. And most of the tribes that have gaming are limited gaming tribes, meaning there are fewer than 350 slot machines. And they just provide jobs and, some form of attracting people to their communities.
Yeah, I'd say they're pretty much just keeping the lights on and keeping people employed. What would you like people to know that have misconceptions about gaming? Can you explain some of the positive things that it has done for tribes that have directed their resources in so many good ways? Could you provide some examples and explain to people what gaming has done for certain tribes?
Yeah, and we're talking about this. There's going to be a Truth and Healing Council report that's going to come out from the governor's office that's going to talk about Indian policy in California. And one of the things we talk about in that report is the effect of gaming and the revenues from gaming and how it has uplifted those tribes. And it has allowed the tribes to become advocates at the state capitol and change the laws to provide greater protections to tribal cultural resources, to protect Indian children through the Indian Child Welfare Act, and to allow for this land return and land stewardship, cultural burns, cultural fire, to be able to show that tribes are actually really beneficial. And the gaming revenue's really been the way that tribes have been able to do that.
Thank you. So lastly, I'm just going to ask you to look into the future and what do you see coming down the pipe as the major issues affecting California Indian country?
One of the major issues is the internet. And there's pros and cons with the internet and data sovereignty. What does it mean to be protecting our data? And what is our data? Who is collecting our data? Is the Department of Interior going to review applications to take land into trust using AI? If they're going to use AI, what does the AI know about us? Our websites, they don't always tell the public very much about us. And since there's very little information about Indian nations and tribal nations, then how is AI going to know what to say about us or think about us? So AI, online gaming, sports betting, those are data protection, data sovereignty, and protecting tribes from threats, cyber attacks, and those that want to do harm to Indian country through the internet and through infrastructure, I think are our next level concerns.
Well, it's fascinating. I'm really glad that you brought those points up. Michelle Lee, I could talk to you forever about this stuff. Thank you so much for joining us here on Reclaiming Our Stories. It's been an honor to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, for inviting me.
Reclaiming Our Stories podcast is made possible with support from the 11th Hour Project, the Weingart Foundation, and By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a nationwide initiative led by the Federation of State Humanities Councils in partnership with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We also thank the Autry Museum of the American West for partnering with us in hosting our live podcast event. Together, these partners help make it possible to share stories that deepen understanding of the many cultures and histories that shape California.
Salisha.
Salisha. Skuta kialasan. Skuta kialasan. Ya, 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 ya. Tani kilikiu. Tani kilikiu.
For my second guest, I'll be joined by Nicole Myers-Lim of the Pomo tribe. Nicole has advanced degrees from the University of California at Berkeley and the University of San Francisco School of Law. She is descended from the Pinole Band of Pomo Indians and works for the National Indian Justice Center and the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, where she serves as the executive director, and she has worked there since 1996. Welcome, Nicole. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to focus today on California specifically. In California, there are, at last count, at least 109 federally recognized tribes within the state of California, and as many as 60 plus unrecognized tribes. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what federal recognition does for tribes and how does it affect tribes that aren't federally recognized.
Sure. Federal recognition essentially boils down to having an official relationship with the United States government. Often that came by way of treaties or other agreements. And with the unique history of California and the different phases of colonization and genocide, the dispossession of land came early on for many California tribes. So if you actually laid a map of non-federally recognized tribes across a map of the California missions, you would find a direct correlation. And so I think it's really critical to understand that land dispossession impacted whether or not tribes had that official relationship. And when it comes to the treaties in California, our treaties were never ratified. They were kept in an injunction of secrecy for 50 years. And so our tribes were landless. And essentially it was also coincided with the time during the War of Extermination where we were on the run for survival. That was another layer of land dispossession that occurred. And so that resulted in many tribes not having federal recognition. The majority of the tribes in California who are federally recognized are tribes who got land through the Rancheria Act, but that didn't come until 1908. And so there are tribes that exist with an official relationship, and there are tribes that are no different that exist with an unofficial relationship. And so that impacts a tribe's rights based on whether or not they're seen as government-to-government entities. It impacts their rights when it comes to consultation. It impacts their rights when it comes to any legislation that looks at tribes as having sovereignty and political status. It impacts their rights to compete for federal grants, for monies, to develop justice systems, to deliver education. It impacts their rights all across the board. And so, it's an inherent inequity and unfairness, and it's not by our own design, right? I often feel like the federal government has created a lot of these complexities, but then utilizes them as an excuse to say, oh, well, we're not required to deal with you because you're non-federally recognized. And so in a way, they get it both ways. They get to have their cake and eat it too, because they don't really have to stand up and be accountable for the inequity and injustice that has been created at their own hands.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing that always strikes me when I'm looking at California specifically is the lack of federally recognized tribes along the coast. I was wondering if you have a theory on why that is.
Well, I definitely think that goes back to that relation to the mission system and how the missions, really targeted areas of Native people that were the most densely populated north of Mexico City. So you see Chumash territory, you see Ohlone territory. So all these areas that there were large populations of Native people living and thriving, but they were targeted, we have one federally recognized tribe in Chumash territory, but we have 50 different Chumash tribes there, right? And so it really has to do with the time and place of when tribes were hit by colonization and the different historical factors that they were impacted by.
Right. And I always think that the value of those particular parts of the state, the land, also can affect whether or not those tribes are recognized, because if they were recognized, they would have potentially more rights to access the land and to reclaim ownership. Is that correct?
Definitely. We're looking at tribes who've been seeking recognition for 4 or 5 decades. and they live in the most expensive places in the United States, right? San Francisco, the East Bay, Los Angeles, all of these areas where recognition or the seeking recognition becomes a very political strategy as well. And so, that's unfortunate because it shouldn't be political, but it has to deal with economics and land and politics, and creates this situation where tribes are just, held back, held down, and not able to achieve recognition because of all these factors that are working against them.
Part of being a federally recognized tribe requires the tribe to have some form of government. And that is in order for the federal government to have that government-to-government relationship with each individual tribe. I was wondering if you could speak about the type of tribal governments that are pervasive in California, and whether or not those would be seen as traditional governments, and how having this modern form of government affects tribes.
Well, I think traditionally, and it's interesting because when you read anthropologists or historians, they often feel compelled to compare California tribes and tribal governments to things that they observed in the East. And our tribal governments traditionally were very localized. So they weren't, the type of confederacies and things that they looked to that actually inspired democracy in many levels. But that localized type of governance and ruling wasn't less than, it was just different, right? And so there was a lot more focus on, having issues resolved locally within the community, and using tradition and culture and values and oral history as a way of governing and ruling and protecting the community. And then there was a lot of, kind of intersectionality in terms of how governance over how people were married into different tribes, and a lot of relationship with our land and the environment, and how we moved and didn't impact resources to the degree that, they couldn't thrive. And I think that, that was kind of looked at through a Western lens that characterized us as less than, uncivilized, primitive, very one-dimensional. The whole hunter-gatherer really doesn't describe sustainable agricultural, traditional ecological knowledge. All of those things we were discounted. And that was by design, because of the way that colonization and the doctrine of discovery works. It really focuses on making us incompetent and having federal plenary power and authority essentially over us, because the assumption is that we can't handle that ourselves. and those themes have found their way into the law, and they're what we have to deal with today. And so when we look at modern tribal governments, that legacy is from the imposition of the Indian Reorganization Act, which really tried to put kind of a corporate context on tribal governments. But essentially what it did was made them very one-dimensional. It put a lot of power in kind of the executive or the tribal council, and it really led to a lot of instability. And so when you match that with the Rancheria Act and the fact that our people were on the run for survival, and they created rancherias around where they considered so-called homeless Indians were living. It was where Indians were living for survival, to get work, to have jobs. It's hard to recreate tradition and culture in that kind of dislocation and dispossession. And so it creates inherent inequity. It creates conflict. It creates, what I often refer to as a scarcity mentality, where we're all fighting for what we feel are limited resources, and we're put in competition with one another for the little things that the government provides to us. And so, even within that traditional governments, while it was regional and local, there still was a collective body and a consideration and cooperation with other tribal communities. My great grandparents spoke 4 different dialects of our Pomo languages. They intermarried, they worked around. There weren't these like artificial boundaries that we have now with like northern, southern, central. And so I really feel like a lot of what has been created is around legal fictions and things that are meant to divide us. My father always told me, Indians weren't meant to be here in 2026. And so, we're dealing with survival, and luckily we can rely on our own resilience. But a lot of what we have to do is kind of piecemeal things back together to work within a system that was never really meant to support us in the first place. And that takes a lot of creativity on the part of our Native people in trying to respond in the way the government sets forth its assaults on our people, our land, our culture, our children, our communities.
I think that's a really important point that you said. We weren't supposed to be here in 2026. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the fiction or the story of the dying race, of how assimilation was used, and ultimately, the founders of this country spoke on Native people as a group of people who would not exist in the future.
Yeah, it's like the old adage, the end of the trail or the last of the tribe, right? We see that on many different levels, and in all of the different waves of colonization, there was an attempt to find the last Indian, because if you have the last of, then you fulfilled manifest destiny, right? We've either been physically annihilated or we've been assimilated into the mainstream, not on an equitable level, but in a position of servitude. And so we see this happen in the mission system. There was an Indian man who they called Old Gabriel. He was said to be the oldest living person in the New World. In fact, they have a plaque in the Vatican for Old Gabriel. And he remembered when Father Sarah came to California. We don't know exactly how old he is. He said he outlived 7 wives, so I guess he earned his old age. But Old Gabriel was buried at, I think, San Miguel. And when Father Sarah died, they exhumed his body and moved him to Mission Carmel, because he was so important and symbolic within the Catholic Church as being kind of labeled the last so-called real Indian in California. And then, we get to the 20th century, and what do we see? Ishi, the last wild Indian of California, right? So again, here, there's an attempt by anthropology to label Ishi as the last authentic, right? And their narrative was that he lived out in the wild, untouched by civilization, versus his reality, which was that he lived in hiding for 30 years because his family suffered 3 massacres. And when he came out of hiding, he thought that he was going to be hanged. And so, he had fear of white society, yet as an individual Indian, he could not live alone. So he faced that fear to come out and engage with the people that he, avoided. And so there's always this narrative. And I think today what I see a lot in the youth that I work with at the museum is that they don't feel Indian enough. And whether that's because they don't qualify for enrollment, or their family was disenrolled, or they're constantly questioned about, oh, wow, you're Native, I didn't realize that, or a real Indian should be this and that. There's always this sense that we're not enough. And so, by design, they never wanted us to still be here. the effort was always to end us, because that's what was going to fulfill manifest destiny. That's what they considered God ordained. That's what they considered necessary to make the way for their so-called civilization and progress. But we're still here. And they didn't count on that.
Right.
And so, that's the important story, is like the resilience and tenacity of our people to, just still maintain our cultures and languages and songs in the face of extreme adversity against all odds, and to still be here and to still fight. I think that's the important story for our people.
I agree. I often tell people, especially when I speak on the artwork that I do, that I'm a modern person, and we as Native people are allowed to evolve and adapt, and we're allowed to be modern people as well, and it doesn't make us any less Indian. Can you talk a little bit about how tribes are trying to kind of reverse engineer sort of culture back into these systems that have been thrust upon us, and the difficulties in doing so?
Yeah, I think it's really out of our own necessity. And I say that because of public health. I think there was Virginia Hendrick. She had a study that she did, and she quoted that compared birth records and death records of California Native people. And the finding was that we're born Indian, but we die white. And what that tells me essentially is that along the way, these public health systems that are supposed to be designed to help us erase us. And that, the things that we deal with related to our health and vitality, we don't have access to our traditional foods. We don't have the ability to eat the food that's meant for our DNA. We don't have all the access to mental health treatments in a way that are designed to elevate culture, which is what we need to protect us from the negative outcomes of historical trauma. So I think the way that we're reclaiming culture is really important. And I say that in terms of, like you said, being a modern Indian doesn't make you less Indian. Culture is dynamic, changing, shifting, and being redefined by the children who are living it. And so we want our children to be lifelong cultural learners, but we have to be able to give them the tools and the resources to do that. And I can't wait to see the things that they do in the future. I can't wait to see how our kids come back into these university archives and redefine and reclaim our cultural heritage that's been, locked there. So I think that there's a lot of really important work where tribes are looking at food sovereignty, land back, re-engaging with archives and collections and oral history, and telling our own story, where we're really in this situation where it's a renaissance of California Indian culture, and how lucky we are to be living in a time where we can celebrate it and benefit from it, because we know that our parents and grandparents didn't get that opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like the sacrifices of those, 7 generations ago are finally coming around full circle for this younger generation. So the last question I have for you is, looking forward, what would you say are some of the big issues that are at stake for California tribes today and into the next few decades?
I think back to the tribe. My tribe was terminated in the 1950s, and our recognition was restored. That's why I'm proud to carry the Myers name, as my grandmother, Tilly Myers Hardwick, and my father, Joseph Myers, were named plaintiffs on a class action lawsuit that restored our recognition. Our recognition was restored in 1983, along with 16 other tribes. And my grandmother was always very proud of that. My father had some different perspectives on it. He remembered the time that the Bureau of Indian Affairs came in and brought pictures of white picket fences and modern kitchens and told our tribal community, if you sign off on termination, you're going to live the American dream. And he said, jokingly, that after the meeting, he ran to the mirror and just saw the same face staring back at him. Like there was no big change. And for, 2.5 decades, there wasn't any big change. And so my grandmother was able to sue on the fact that the government hadn't made good on its promises. But my dad said that my grandfather, who lived to be, or his grandfather, my great-grandfather, he lived to be 103 years old. And he was very proud of being Pomo. He ran a race, the Great Redwood Marathon, under the name Chief Ukiah. It was something that he took great pride in. And he died during that time that we were terminated. And he died during that time when we were told we weren't a tribe anymore. And that it must have been really sad for him. And I see that now as one of our big challenges, because I see a younger generation that isn't going to qualify for the way we have used legal fictions to define membership. And if our younger generation and kids and their kids aren't seen as Native Americans, the federal government and the state government's definitely going to say, we don't have any responsibility to you. So I'm really concerned about how we identify ourselves as Native people and how we're counted as Native people. Because I can tell you, when it comes to education, the student count is an undercount. And if we don't have a good counting of our Native students, then we can't demand to ask how much money is being spent on every student for education. So these are all the things that we have, these really broken systems that rely on legal fiction, and it doesn't fulfill our sovereignty. Sovereignty is fragile. It's subject to a legislative pen. It could go away tomorrow. What's important is the sovereignty of our minds, the sovereignty of our cultures, the sovereignty of our land and our ancestral territory. It's really about, being sovereign it's about what can't be taken from you. And I think that we have to ensure that we strengthen our younger generation so it can't be taken from them. It's been taken before, and it's been taken from our people, but we're resilient and we brought it back. But we really have to prepare them for the challenges of their future. And we can't do that using these broken systems of oppression.
Nicole Myers-Lim, that's a very beautiful and powerful message. And I think we'll end with that. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and you really inspired me to preserve the sovereignty of my own mind and think about sovereignty existing in that way. And so I thank you for that. And it was really lovely to talk to you. And I look forward to visiting you at the museum soon.
Thank you.
I'd like to leave you with a question based on today's episode. Where do we see the limits of recognition? And what would justice require beyond acknowledgement? Before we wrap up, we want to invite you to something special. On Saturday, June 27th, Reclaiming Our Stories, Voices of Indigenous Peoples of California will be recorded live at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. This live event will bring together voices from the podcast for an evening of conversation, storytelling, and reflection on Indigenous histories, cultures, and futures. If you'd like to experience the conversation in person, we hope you'll join us. You can learn more and reserve your spot at calhum.org. I want to thank our guests, Michelle Lee of the Pit River Tribe and Cahuilla Tribe, and Nicole Myers-Lim of the Pomo Tribe for joining us today. You've been listening to Reclaiming Our Stories, Voices of Indigenous Peoples of California, created by California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. To learn more about this podcast and the work of California Humanities, visit calhum.org. Until next time, keep listening because every story connects us to land, community, and to one another.
Reclaiming Our Stories podcast is made possible with support from the 11th Hour Project, the Weingart Foundation, and By the People Conversations Beyond 250, a nationwide initiative led by the Federation of State Humanities Councils in partnership with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We also thank the Autry Museum of the American West for partnering with us in hosting our live podcast event. Together, these partners help make it possible to share stories that deepen understanding of the many cultures and histories that shape California.